Namaste. Welcome to my podcast. All right, this is part two of my conversation with Raghu Ananthanarayanan. If you remember the first conversation, we had discussed different types of archetypes that are there when looked at it from an Indic perspective. And if you remember from that conversation, we had discussed something to do with Mahabharata and how Mahabharata also had some inherent archetypes and how Mahabharata can be interconnected to our daily lives, and we can use stories and examples from within the Mahabharata and live our life accordingly in today's day and age. So what happens is Raghu has I don't know what word should I use for this. Raghu calls it the Mahabharata Immersion. So I thought, why not we actually discuss the immersion? I mean, it's like a lab sort of a thing. So I told Raghu, you know what, you have to come back and we need to discuss the Mahabharata immersion in details. So here we go. So welcome to the podcast, Raghu.
Hi, Kushal. Thanks for inviting me back.
All right, Raghu. So before we start this discussion, I actually wanted to ask you this first question because even I was kind of, not sure how to present this in the monologue too. But what is an immersion, or if we want to call it a lab? So first, let's start with that, and then we can go into, the its importance from an Indic point of view. So can you explain that to the listeners?
Sure. See, there are various levels of learning. Uh, for example, the most common way of learning is when somebody with knowledge teaches somebody. So there's a lot of information download and things like that, and the person who's learning just takes in the information, and mostly it's memory and that sort of a thing is what is involved in this process. The second type of learning is some kind of a tutorial type of stuff where some problems are given, you work out the problems, you go back to the teacher, see if you've done it correctly, and things like this, right? And this is especially useful in science and math and all of that. There is a third kind of thing that is a little common in organizational learning contexts and some other contexts, which is what is generally called a role play. So you play the role of X or Y and therefore understand a lot more about what might be happening inside the person, and also understand behavior a little more directly, because obviously behavior is something that cannot be just taught informatively. You have to show. So these are called experiential forms of learning. And a laboratory learning is something much deeper than even this role play, where a person, in a group, looks at themselves, their own experiences, what is happening inside them in the here and now, as the basic stuff from which one learns. And so people share of each other, and there are no, a good lab has a facilitator who's listening in and enabling this process of trust to develop, people to share deep stuff from inside, and does not bring in too much of a theory. So the behavior is not explained so much as frameworks given through which the person can develop their own understanding of their behavior. Yeah, and immersion is something that I've been working on, which uses a lot of the laboratory learning techniques. So we have a group situation, we have people sharing from themselves, and additionally in the immersion, I'm bringing in a lot of ideas from yoga, which goes a little further in my understanding, because in yoga, the central practice is the practice of observing oneself from a place of dhyana. So while some of the techniques that are used to enable the group to share are borrowed from the laboratory learning. I'm additionally bringing in some techniques from yoga to help a person go a little deeper in a sense, locate themselves in a place of quietude, and then observe from there.
All right. So now I have a question about that. Now, in our last conversation, we were discussing about archetypes, and how Jungian archetypes have a lot of overlap with Indian archetypes too. So obviously, I don't want to revisit that aspect. But what got me interested in it again is because. Basically what we are discussing here is psychology and sociology. So why do you think it is important to have, say, a perspective which is uniquely Indian or Indic when it comes to psychology and sociology? Because this is where I'm coming from. Because for me, at the end of the day, there are human universals. So we will have behavioral patterns cutting across all races, right? And all cultures. Where, I mean, you could be a European, you could be an Indian, but there might be certain, evolutionary traits that are common amongst every human being. Obviously, culture has a huge role to play. So my question basically is why is Indic sociology and psychology important, and what is the role of culture in that, and where do we draw that distinction or line?
Okay, you've asked a big question. Let me try and look at it in chunks. See, in any person's behavior, there are several levels. At one level, all of us are human, and therefore we share a whole cross section of characteristics and behaviors which are human. And then if you go down further and further, we internalize many things from our environment as part of our learning as we grow and part of how we adjust to our environments. So the families we are born in, the culture we are born in, the nations we are born in, and very importantly, the language we use to communicate, all of these start playing an important part. And at the other end of the whole spectrum, each of us is also unique. Yeah, so it is true that there are broad similarities. There are, even archetypal things would have a spread, because recently, last time I did the Mahabharata Immersion, we had one person from Israel who's a Jungian psychologist who had come over, and we had another person who's from Belgium, and we have people from across India. Now, it's very interesting that all of them could share with each other what was happening inside them, right? At the same time, when we went through some of the exercises and explorations and simulations, each of them got something for themselves that was unique. Yeah, this is why a laboratory learning is important, because I, as a facilitator, am not specifying what must be learned. I'm offering a mirror, I'm offering a space and certain kinds of experiences that people go through, which make them more and more self-reflective. And so, to answer your other question, why is Indic important? See, while I've done labs for a number of people from various countries and all that, there is a difference which is quite palpable, Kushal. See, for example, the focus on an individual and autonomy and agency is much higher in people from the West than from people in the East. And this is quite observable. And I'm not saying East only in India. I've had some work with some Chinese people also. For most Eastern people, their belonging has a very large part to play in their identity formation. So I'm part of a belonging system first and an individual later. Whereas in most Western people, the individuality as a separate person becomes very critical. Now, this is not a trivial uh, difference, because a lot of things spring from this. For example, the idea of a hero. I think we discussed it last time also. The idea of a hero in a Western context is like a Hercules, which is very individualistic. Whereas the idea of heroism in an Indian context, and I think also in most uh, Eastern context, but definitely in India, has a lot to do with how I bring back dharma, how do I act for a group. Therefore, the call to heroism does not come from an individual search. The call comes from what is it that I can do for a system. And there are huge, profound differences in the way I would then use my capabilities, the way I would share what I have, and so on. Yeah, unfortunately, today the idea of heroism is moving more and more towards agency. So when you have a country like India, which is traditionally, culturally oriented towards more of sharing with the group, and your heroism or your use of your great abilities is anchored in group. If you if you put in this individualistic thing, I think a lot of opportunism is taking over. So it is nice to have something individually, but then it breaks up the fabric of a culture. Yes, we see that in many spaces. For example, I do a lot of work with villages and grassroots development. The way they trust people who, in a sense, belong to their community is very high. Now, when this person gets into a position of power, if he loses his idea that his importance and his heroism ought to be anchored in what he does for his group and starts becoming individualistic, there is a great deal of letdown in the people and cynicism. And this has been happening now, I think, for decades, where the simple people trust those people in power. The people in power are not acting from the same idea of self and same idea of collective as the people who trust them. And they then go on to become extremely self-centered. And this is a big rupture.
Actually, I would like to come in here because you've actually spoken about something very deeply, problematic in our society.
Yeah.
And as you were speaking, I started thinking about it. That a lot of times, I'm purely speaking from my point of view of my individual, personhood. So I'm not speaking on behalf of all Indians. Before somebody says, "Oh, I'm not like that." No. I'm only literally speaking as I was listening to you, I was trying to understand it, that how would Kushal react in this situation. And this is something that me as a person who's lived partly in the West and most of his life in the East, but I have family in the West, and I mean my wife is a Westerner. So I've always had discussions, and I've obviously, as someone who reads a lot and listens to other people talk a lot, so I find this discussion between individualism, Western individualism, and Eastern collectivism very fascinating, because at the end of the day, if we look at it again, I bring in evolutionary psychology every time I discuss this, is that at the end of the day we are all uh, collectivists at some level. Because even if we talk about a Hercules, it was not like Hercules was doing it for himself. Hercules was doing it for some sort of a community or a tribe. I mean, so my question to you would be, in this in this obsession with individualism in the West, I always see that they somehow brush away the Indian individualistic aspect, and I look at Buddha, Mahavir, and all the great saints as individualists of some sort. not collectivists, because they obviously were fighting for a cause and for the society at large, but their awakening was very personally driven. So how do we draw that distinction? I mean, are we trying to say that we are out and out collectivists? Because that's something I find very hard to digest, at least for me at a personal level.
No, like I said in the beginning, we share certain things universally. So I'm not doing an A versus B. I'm saying there is a difference in emphasis for sure. Right. Now you brought in Buddha and his enlightenment. It's very interesting that the final frontier that Buddha crosses is, he deals with Mara, he deals with desire, he deals with fear, and then he deals with filial piety, which means his commitment to his community and his family. That's the final barrier he has to cross. Whereas if you look at the final frontiers of Christ, he is offered forms of power. He's offered the dominion over, the King of Kings. He's offered the high priest of, Solomon's place and things like this. So obviously there is some difference in the psyche. And I don't think, if you look at yogic thought and Indian thought, there is no such thing as an individual enlightenment. So if Buddha has an enlightenment, he is part of a collective consciousness, and his enlightenment impacts the entire collective. It impacts all of humanity. This is a very fundamental idea, right? So even your question, for example, is coming from an idea of man, which is different from the way a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Jain philosophy would look at it.
Oh, I completely agree with you. That's why, I am the weird one, right? We are Cārvākas. So we always think on different time zones, I guess. So that's why I've always struggled with this personally. That's why I said it is only about me, because my personhood as such has become that, I've always been very confused, because I feel a huge sense of kinship in a lot of traits with Indians or with Easterners in general. But I would be a liar that there are moments when I'm with Westerners and I feel, I can relate to them.
Of course.
In this one.
Yeah, of course. I love Dylan's songs and so on. So, of course, we can relate. But if the underlying idea of the self is based on something very personal and something separate, like an individual, right? What it does is it allows social theories like utilitarianism to catch on very quickly. Whereas when your idea of the self and idea of being human has a large collective as the base, and therefore balance with ecology, balance with other people, and so on, your way you act and the way you think becomes different. I'll just give you an example. See, when I do work with the grassroots, the couple of friends of mine, we formed a group called the Barefoot Academy for Governance. We do a lot of grassroots work. And we've developed a whole way of working with people at the grassroots called the Khuddam. Now, the Khuddam is an old Indian way of collective working, right? And the fundamental tenet of a Khuddam is to say that can we come together? Khuddam actually in Tamil means coming together, and there are similar words all over India and Southeast Asia. So people come together and they say that within this space, we will come together for a dharmic ideal which is greater than all our individual belongings. So it's very fascinating because you're giving space for individual belonging. There is no problem. But when you come here, you create another space and set aside your individual belonging, and you come together for a dharmic cause. And there's a sense of us, a newly developed or a specific sense of us in the Khuddam. And in the Khuddam, there are no differences at all of age or position or status or anything. People actually come and work together. It's just fascinating to watch this. Right? Now, this to me talks of a psyche which is capable of a number of things. It is capable of understanding roles as the primary basis for defining myself. So when I'm in a community, I'm playing one kind of a role. When I go into a group, I play a different kind of role. The second thing is, it says that the idea of myself is fluid. So I can be different selves, I can be different people. There's not too much of a problem about it. It allows for different levels of simultaneously belonging to different groups of people. It allows for pattern thinking because of all this. These are all fascinating abilities. And being able to study and understand this and work with it, I think is very critical for the future of India, because we are overlaying this natural ability or whatever cultural ability we've got with ideas which are very, very foreign to us. Yeah, like in development field is very, very clear. People come with an idea of development which is largely, unfortunately coming from the West, and they have, economic indicators, they have so many indicators without understanding the psyche of the people and treat people as agentic.
All right. So obviously now my question would to you would be that why should I or anyone attend a Mahabharata immersion? When I say why, in terms of how can I use this as a tool to self reflect, and why should I come to you?
Good question. I'd love for you to come to me, but that's a different matter. See, one of the things that the Mahabharata immersion does is it allows you to get into a certain understanding of the Mahabharata from the inside. And like I was talking about this earlier also, an archetype is something that is deep inside us. And the more we learn how to look at ourselves from deep inside, from a place of shantam or quietude, we not only have a greater understanding of who we are, we also have options, and we understand where we have got caught with conditioned behavior, what are the limitations, and so on. See, we often internalize a range of behavior as very comfortable. And beyond this range, we actually find it difficult to explore ourselves because we experience pain, or we experience danger, or we experience fear, and so on. It's not possible to deal with it externally or superficially, because these are fears that are very deep inside, and they've got embedded, in early experiences and so on. It's only through processes like an immersion that one can actually get in touch with these parts of ourselves and release ourselves from this. Yeah, and in that process, a whole range of external behavior automatically gets opened out. And the Mahabharata is especially powerful in doing this because it juxtaposes a lot of very interesting characters who have the same heroic potential, if you want to call it. Like a Bhima or a Duryodhana or Yudhishthira and Bhishma. Yeah, there are several people, Sahadeva and Vidura. These are all similar characters, similar capabilities at one level, but for various reasons, you can see that their behaviors get caught in one or the other problem. Now, this reflection enables you to discover things in yourself. And because I brought together the yoga part along with all of the other Mahabharata reflection stuff, actually what I'm doing is quite unique, and I have some confidence in saying this because I met up with Dr. Anand Paranjipe a few weeks back, and he was quite happy with the way I was doing things and what I had brought together. And his affirmation was very important to me because he's one of the few people who knows Western psychology very well and who knows Indian psychology and philosophy very well. So his, in a sense, affirming that what I'm doing is right and is meaningful was very, very good.
Now in the Mahabharata immersion, obviously, when somebody joins and starts experiencing it at a personal level, they'll realize that it's not just Mahabharata. You actually combine a lot of other aspects from or other dharmic tools are combined with the Mahabharata as Mahabharata aspect itself in the immersion. I remember I think even in the last podcast you had mentioned that you use a lot of inspiration from the Yoga Sutras or from Natya Shastra. Now, Natya Shastra is something that got me interested. So, can you explain? And I would expect some detail, especially when it comes to these things, so that because the layperson listening to this may not even know how can they use something like Natya Shastra in exploring themselves. So can you explain that aspect?
The interesting thing is, when the Vedic stuff was written, there seems to have been an understanding that some of these are very difficult truths for people to comprehend. And therefore, if we have to help people to look at some of these truths, it has to be couched in a language of rasa, anubhava. So the Puranas and the Itihasas and all that have this underlying design criterion in them. Music definitely has, and dance definitely has this. Yeah. So how is, let's say, dance a way of looking at oneself? See, to answer this question, you first have to look at the fact that none of the people being portrayed are people in the sense that we experience them in normal life. A Krishna being portrayed or a Gopika being portrayed is parts of ourselves, right? And if you look at the tradition, there's one very interesting tradition in the South, which is called the Nika, the various stages of the Nika. And there, the progression is very, very beautiful because the Nika starts with what one would experience as a child, wonderment and things like that, and goes through various stages which have a parallel with the stages of one's own chakra maturing and also growing up in age. Yeah, so for example, you have a stage of growth where the Nika becomes very conscious of the right things to do and hopes that because she's doing the right thing, she's dressing up the right way and so on, Krishna will come to her. Now, this is a stage of our own growth where we have to go through a certain understanding and an internalization of social mores, social injunctions, and so on, so that we can attract the kind of affirmation and the kind of caring and love from other people, right? Crossing this stage actually is very difficult because you have to give up a sense of dependence and grow into a stage where you actually go searching for your own truth and so on. And that's also depicted very beautifully in the Natya Shastra. So this is the stage where they, talk about searching for Krishna, seeing small glimpses of him, Krishna being lost, myself being lost, and so on. So each of these actually reflects a very important stage of one's own growth, and it depicts it very beautifully. So the search itself becomes, a very rasatmic search, if I can say it that way. The other critical thing to understand is that through our growth and through the way we, are responded to when we are children, how society responds to us, and so on. certain, I have to call them rasas because emotion is a similar word, but not exactly, doesn't capture this. Rasa actually also captures a psychosomatic response to many things, yeah, to life itself in a sense. So we seem to internalize certain injunctions and then some feelings, some emotions, and some ways of being get frozen and saying, okay, this is the only way for me to be. Some ways of being are tempting to be, but filled with danger. Some other areas you're allowed a certain sense of freedom. And all of this patterning of the deep inside self is happening at the levels of rasanubhava and so on. In general life, the dance theory says that when you're living your life in general, you don't experience rasa, but it requires an aesthetic appreciation and so on. I'm extending this idea because I've seen it work. When you enable people to become more and more deeply observant of themselves and quietly observant of themselves, they can see how certain feelings have become the central anchors in a sense of their being. So if somebody has got caught, let's say, with reactivity, okay, or counter dependence, if you use the psychological term, then a lot of their interfaces with the world have a certain antagonistic stance with it. We're calling this the guardian or the fighter self inside, right? Now, these are depicted in dance. These are depicted in Mahabharata. These are depicted in the Itihasa Puranas. So through the reflection of these, I can actually come to look at myself and say, this is what my behavior is like, and this is the root of my conditioning. The moment I have this aha moment, there's a release. So the Mahabharata or the dance elements are all means by which I can reach into myself, and they are reflectors. So through various exercises drawn from them, I actually enable people to go more and more inward and see what is the origin of the self. And the more they have a wide range of being able to experience the various rasas without block, like I was telling before, their behavioral patterns changes. Yeah, let me illustrate this. The strange thing is, most women in India are have a lot of issues and blocks around experiencing Shringara Rasa or affection and love. They are warned because they're women, you don't fall for this, don't express love, don't express affection and things like that. So their entire psychosomatic system gets conditioned by this. Now, through the work that we do, I've worked with dancers also who find it very difficult to express certain things because deep inside them they're stuck. So when we work with them through these laboratory and immersion processes, they can actually see where their insides are stuck, where their expression therefore becomes frozen. They have no elasticity or range through which they can express their affection and so on. Yeah. Boys are brought up to say you shouldn't feel fear. So there's a whole set of things that happens because the person is suppressing and repressing their own reactions to fear. And so they become very rigid. This again, one can get in touch with, like, for example, in the last Mahabharata Immersion, one of the things that came up very strongly was while exploring Bhishma, a couple of people came in touch with how they've become extremely rigid inside themselves. And in the name of doing the right thing and so on, they've actually become very dry inside and given up their autonomy, they've given up their choice making, and actually given up their ability to love. These are very poignant things when it happens, Kushal.
I think if somebody was to ask me what is the core difference between the East and the West, I think it is this concept of rasa, right?
Absolutely.
And I mean, I don't know, in Punjabi we have this word, every time in Punjabi they sing, before somebody gets triggered, I mean, they keep using this word jugni in Punjabi.
Ah,
It is used in different contexts in Sufi music. It is used in different contexts in Hindu Punjabi music, and it is used in similar contexts in Sikh songs also. Like in, if a Sadar or in a Hindu Punjabi is singing, Jugni basically means the essence of something
yeah,
in Punjabi.
yeah.
So, could rasa, if we were to, use the right word in English for rasa, would it be the essence of something?
Yes, it would mean essence, but along with essence, it's a whole psychosomatic response to the essence. Recently, I came across a word qualia. I don't know it very well, but it seems like, essentially, something to do with the most basic forms of feelings and things like that. I don't know. Maybe this is an appropriate word. A more academic expert would tell you whether I'm using the right word or not.
Qualia is a Greek word, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So yeah, the Greeks talk about it. Yeah, I've heard Jordan Peterson talk about qualia a lot too. So yeah, so I am familiar with it. I don't know if the listeners will be familiar to it. So now, before we wrap things up, Raghu. So obviously, the most important question. So when are you now going to conduct the next Mahabharata Immersion laboratory or workshop?
Uh, we're having the next one in July.
Okay.
I'll just tell you the dates. Yeah. It's starting on the 20. Uh, it's starting on the 23rd of July and going on for a week till the 28th. Yeah, and if people look up our website, ritambara.org.in, you can get the details.
All right, cool. So before we wrap things up now, a message to the listeners. See, you guys must be wondering that why does this guy actually have these kinds of discussions? Kisko padi hai, ye wo, and these are very important questions, by the way. Because I've gone through those phases in my life too. Uh, Obviously, my podcast is about what I think it's important, and I will do what I want to do. That's a separate issue, but I'll still try to sell the importance of something like this to you. And it's very important that Raghu does not do it. I should be doing it because I'm the one who's inviting Raghu. So I must be thinking that there's something to it, right? So here's my attempt to sell the importance of understanding yourself at a deeper level, and that too in the right cultural context. So this is my attempt. So here we go. See, we all go through different phases in our life. Obviously, what I was as an individual at the age of 2021 is very different from what I am at the age of 37 today. I'm a completely new person. I think it's almost as if, if I try and remember what I used to think or what opinions I had on some things when I was like 21 or 25, I think, what the hell was I thinking? I myself don't like myself. There are moments where I feel ashamed. But what you do get once you start growing up, and once you start introspecting, and once you start thinking deeply about yourself or about your karma, uh, is that you start getting a lot of answers, and you keep becoming a better human being. And I think at the end of the day, if you are a nice person, your whole aim in life has to be that, how do I become a better human being? How do I treat others? How do I look at a situation from a nuanced point of view? And it reflects in your behavior everywhere. Now, obviously, the primary audience of this podcast is on social media. That is where everybody actually, goes and clicks on the link. So why I'm saying this is, and I'm going to, Raghu must be thinking, what the hell is he doing? But behavior on Twitter, right? How we behave on social media matters. You might think, who cares? I just go to social media to annoy people. But if you're going on social media and your sole aim is actually to annoy people, that says a lot about you as a person. If that's all you're going there for. And I have changed as an individual in the last 4 or 5 years. If somebody sees my social media avatar for the last 4 or 5 years, and you can go and dig my tweets, I was an annoying person. And in my case, it just happened that one day I was like, what the hell am I doing? Why am I going online and shouting at people? And I changed, and now I try to have meaningful discussions. In fact, I don't have any discussions because I believe that that whole medium is garbage now. But what I'm trying to say through this medium, which I try to explore, and try to get people who I feel know a lot more than I do in that subject. Like, I know Raghu knows a lot more than I do, and I try to learn from Raghu because I'm a sucker for knowledge. What I'm trying to tell all of you is that please try to become better at what you do. Don't try, and it's very important to not have an opinion on everything. It takes a lot of courage and a lot of humility at the same time to say that you don't know something. And at least it's something that I've learned after living my life, and talking to people like Raghu and a lot of other people who come on my podcast, is that I have the real realization that I don't know a lot of things. Yes, I don't know. And it's very important to accept that you don't know. The day you accept you don't know is the day you will stop becoming an annoying idiot. So, with that useless message, thanks a lot for doing this, Raghu.
No, you're welcome. You're welcome, Kushal. Because for me, it's not spreading this understanding that what is Indian has to be looked at afresh is very important, because a lot of ways in which it's being looked at now is from lenses that are not compatible with the reality of who we are. And the consequences of this is actually very deep, because it ends up with a lot of people feeling ashamed of who they are when they actually ought to be proud of who they are. And if
No, I
we as
couldn't
Indians
agree
pick
more.
up pride, if we as Indians retain pride, we can look at our negatives also with a lot more honesty, and also obviously contribute a hell of a lot more from who we are and being the best that we can be.
Well, I hope people understand what you're trying to say, and they act upon it. So once again, Raghu, thanks a lot. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much, Kushal. I enjoyed it too. You ask very interesting questions.
I try my best. Take care. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.